Let's kickstart our political stock exchange for the US elections. I'm joined on this broadcast by Michael Kugelman, Director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center. Katherine Hader is at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We've got Daniel Brook from Foreign Affairs. I'll be joined by other guests during this broadcast as well. What I want to show you is just the extent to which America seems divided at this time. Looked at by demography and looked at by gender, America seems wildly split between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. I'll start with women who overwhelmingly, on account of issues like abortion, reproductive rights, seem to be leaning towards Kamala Harris. According to the NBC News' national poll, the last poll that came out, Kamala Harris has a 16-point advantage over Donald Trump. 57% women in the poll saying they're voting for Kamala Harris, 41% saying they're voting for Donald Trump. So big lead there for Kamala Harris amongst women who are, in terms of registered voters, a bigger chunk of the American population than men are. The moment we switch to men and look at voting preferences amongst men, this is where the Kamala Harris campaign seems to be running behind the Trump campaign, because here there is an 18-point lead that Donald Trump has. 58% of the men polled by NBC say that they're going to vote for Donald Trump, 40% saying they will vote for Kamala Harris. So if this was just men, Donald Trump would be winning and winning easy. If this was just about women, Kamala Harris would be winning and winning easily. We do a lot of this in India as well, and very rarely is the difference as stark. The gap in terms of voting preferences between men and women, very rarely quite as stark. I want to go across to our first guest. I'll start with Katherine Hader at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Usually, pollsters have a good sense, as do commentators, about who seems to be in front. This is one of those elections where everyone just says, let's just sit back and watch what happens. It's really about who can bring voters out on polling day. From what you're seeing around you, which campaign do you think is looking stronger this morning?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think polling as a science, as you alluded to in the beginning, is sort of having a moment, and that it's becoming harder and harder to get accurate polls. I think you found that in India in your last election, and we're certainly finding it here. So I don't know. I think what you get from the polls depends on which polls you read a lot of the time. Personally, when it's this close, I think it'll be not only who comes out to vote, who's registered, who comes out to vote, but where they come out to vote. And we're really down to 7 swing states, and within those states, there are certain swing districts. So I think the closeness of the race is all going to depend on those districts and who comes out there.
Rohit Sharma joins us from Washington. This is, Rohit, really about every constituency, every county, every state, every voter mattering, because it's every little vote that in the end will determine who wins or loses this big presidential election.
Absolutely, Rahul. I mean, we talk about polls, and we've also talked about how close this election is. People are comparing this to the election in the 60s when Kennedy was fighting elections. And look, everybody in America is basically watching what happens tonight. Will America go back to Donald Trump? Will they go back to Kamala? Will they choose Kamala Harris? But importantly, these swing states and these small counties in these swing states will determine who gets to the White House. I mean, you talk about counties, or you're talking about areas around Pittsburgh. You're talking about areas around Philadelphia, Allentown. You're talking about Maricopa County in Arizona. You're talking about the Wake County in North Carolina. These counties hold the key on who goes to the White House. And by the looks of it, it's very close. You talked about the numbers about, how there's a separation between women and men voters who are voting in stark comparison to what they have in the past. Also, the fact that, Rahul, if 10 years ago somebody would have said that Donald Trump would be on stage with Muslim Americans, with Arab Americans, trying to appeal to Hindu Americans, trying to appeal to Latinos and black men, nobody would have bought it. It is that close of an election where Donald Trump is getting out there. He's putting himself out there, trying to build this coalition because he knows this election is very close. And Kamala Harris, on the other hand, she's definitely lost some lead among, the voters, Latino voters and men voters and all that. But she is hoping, and her campaign, when I spoke to them this morning, said They're hoping that women will come out and vote in all those counties that I talked about. The young women, the people who've registered in those colleges, young women in those colleges in some state like North Carolina, they're actually banking that those women will come out and vote for Kamala Harris so she can win this election. We might not know. We could even get to a 269 scenario if the poll is that close. But as of right now, I think America is very excited to take part in this all-consequential election.
Let me not hold you back. We'll come back to you for more later. Thank you very much, Rohit Sharma, for joining us from Washington, D.C. I want to go across to Jant Krishna at the Strategic Center for Strategic and International Studies. Jant, it's really about who can pull more voters out. Men disproportionately seem to be wanting Donald Trump. Women disproportionately seem to be wanting Kamala Harris. From what you can pick up around you, where is the level of enthusiasm to go out and vote? It's one thing to have an opinion, as we saw in Indian states like Haryana recently. It doesn't matter what your opinion is, it matters who you're able to get out to the polling booth on polling day.
Yeah, absolutely, Rahul. I would believe more than the swing states which are being talked about, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, Arizona, Wisconsin, Nevada. I think, they would be crucial, but I think more than that, voter turnout would decide as to who is inside White House next. And also women. If women turnout is proportionately more than men and with little more swing in favor of Kamala Harris, would see her win. But, it's anybody's guess. And it is the most tightly contested U.S. presidential election ever that I remember that I've been tracking in the last 3 decades or so. So I think it's anybody's game. Very, very difficult. No pollster has been able to predict with any accuracy, with any reasonable degree of confidence so far. And it's very, very interesting because both of them have very different take on various things that affect the economy of the U.S., geopolitical stuff and different parts of the world which are especially which are at war, be it Russia or Ukraine or Israel, Gaza, Iran, that area. So I think both have very different takes on that. Let's see which way.
So we're seeing
blow.
Michael Kugelman, a very close contest in the United States. Just for a moment, imagine that this is a global presidential election where the world and their countries get to decide who they want as the president. Who do you think would win internationally? If governments internationally were to decide whether it will be Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, who do you think has the advantage internationally and why?
Well, I think that, on the whole, particularly in a moment like now when there's so much instability and volatility and uncertainty in the world, that many world capitals would prefer to see a leader that they would be most comfortable with, and that would be the one that's the least unpredictable, and that would be Kamala Harris. I think that our U.S. allies and partners that remember how things went during the Trump presidency when the NATO alliance and U.S. relations with treaty allies in Asia took some major blows. And I think that those countries might be a bit concerned about the specter of a return of Trump. But, there are other leaders, I think, that would prefer not to see Harris and would prefer to see Trump. If you talk about a Vladimir Putin, for example. And I think I can't resist saying something about India here. I think that one could argue that there would be trade-offs for India with both Harris and Trump. I think that one could argue that some tension points, whether you're talking about the Russia factor or the issue of human rights, would be less prevalent if Trump were to return to the presidency. But I think that issues like trade tensions could come back to the fore if Trump were to return. Harris, I think, would be someone that that New Delhi would be comfortable working with because I think it would largely be seen as a continuation of the Biden administration to an extent. But at the same time, there might be concerns that a President Harris would be willing, like the Biden administration, to make a bit more noise about internal matters in India, such as rights and so on. So hard to give a short answer.
Well, President Trump might be more mercurial, but he's also transactional. Kamala Harris would likely keep the relationship going in the way that it's built up over the last several years. So both offer very different things. I want to welcome Edward Luce, U.S. National Affairs Editor for the Financial Times, and I'm joined by Dr. Mukesh Aghi, President and CEO of the U.S.-India Strategic Partnership Forum. For a moment, I want to go across to Dr. Aghi. From the perspective of India Inc., India America Business, Do you think Donald Trump works better for that trade relationship or Kamala Harris, or do you think it doesn't really matter so much in the end?
I think it does matter because when you look at Trump has said he is going to impose 20% tax or tariff on goods coming out of India and 60% from China. This will have an impact on India's export into the United States. But more important is you have to understand international relations, international trade is tied to stable, predictable policies. And while you have Biden administration, which has provided that stable policies, which may not agree on all of them, but there is predictability. Trump brings that unpredictability, and that's going to have a big impact on global trade, especially from India coming to the United States.
But Trump also might not be so bothered about some of the things that Kamala Harris might likely get very agitated about. And I think Michael Kugelman referred to that. For example, the manner in which Canada and India's ties have nosedived over the past several weeks on account of the alleged assassination attempt on one person in the United States and the assassination of Niger in Canada. Those kind of things Trump might not care very much about, whereas Kamala Harris might make a lot of noise around issues like that, which would be something that the Indian government would be very wary of.
No, absolutely. But you have to understand there's a big difference between what has happened and how it's been dealt by Canadians and the Americans. While Canadians have taken the lead from the Prime Minister's office, accusing India without any credible evidence that India is behind the assassination, whereas in the United States, it's not the Biden administration which has taken the lead, it's more of the Justice Department which has taken the lead, driven through a process, while India and the United States are working in a very mature manner. So I think that process will continue regardless who comes in, either Trump or Kamala Harris. So I don't think that's not going to change. But overall, I would say that while Trump has stated very clearly that he prefers Prime Minister Modi, he likes Prime Minister Modi, he does not like India as a tariff king itself. So you will see a split approach while he's going to talk about Prime Minister Modi in a very, very positive manner, but he's going to focus a lot on India's tariff. But you have to understand, India has a trade surplus with the United States. Unless that comes to a level between the two countries, he's going to keep on poking at India from a trade perspective.
Okay, I think Mukesh Aghi making clear that from a trade and investment perspective, maybe he thinks Kamala Harris might be more stable and easier to deal with. Thank you very much, Dr. Aghi. We'll come back to you once we actually know who won, and then we'll discuss what impact this has. For the moment, I want to go across to Edward Luce. Mr. Luce, I read your commentary very carefully. You know, this is a very tight election. Is it really just down to those 7 battleground states and who wins those? Or do you think in the other states as well, where everyone's taking for granted that these are either blue or red states, that there could be changes which also people need to look out for very carefully?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, in America's season 8 is not going to end without a surprise twist. And the nature of U.S. politics has been so weirdly a combination of volatility and absolute sort of predictable 50-50 nature. And the combination of those two is something's going to happen in the next 24 hours or in the rest of today that we haven't foreseen. And it might be one of the non-swing states flipping, surprisingly, to the other candidate and changing the whole nature of this race. Or it could be that in spite of the fact this is razor close, dead heat, etc., that we actually get a clear result early this evening and we're all in bed by midnight. I really have no idea. And anybody who does have an idea is bluffing.
Sure. One of the things the Harris campaign seems to be betting on is a stronger ground game. They've outspent the Trump campaign by far. They claim that they've got the maximum number of volunteers on the ground, knocking on doors, urging voters to go out and cast their votes. Do you think that makes much of a difference? Or do you think given the level of polarization, voters will decide one way or the other what they want to do, and it doesn't really matter how strong your ground game is?
I think ground game always matters because, this is not an election of swing voters. This is an election where most people made their mind up ages ago, and therefore the game is to get them to the polling booths and voting. Almost always the presidential candidate with more money wins. The only exception to that was 2016. Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump quite a bit, and of course she lost. Kamala Harris does have more money than Trump. And if you look at the ground game, Trump has outsourced a lot of the work to Elon Musk, to a super PAC created by Elon Musk, who has no previous electoral experience, and there have been some serious problems with what his canvassers have been doing on the ground and whether they've been paid. So there are a lot of eccentricities on the Trump side that if he does come to lose, and I, again, just want to underline, I don't know which way it's going to go, but if he does come to lose, those sorts of decisions will, I think, the Musk one in particular, will feature in the recriminations.
No, because that's the other thing. If he does lose, will he accept the verdict? He's indicated in one or two interviews when he was asked, do you think you can lose? He says, yeah, maybe I might, but I don't think it'll happen. He's accepted the possibility of actually ending up on the losing side. Will he bow down, accept Harris as his president, or will we see another massive ruckus and possible violence after the votes have been counted?
So I don't think violence is nearly as likely, regardless of the outcome, in 2024 as it was last time. Last time Trump was president, and he was inciting the protesters to storm Capitol Hill, and he refused requests to bring in the National Guard to break up the protesters and protect Capitol Hill. This time, whoever wins, Biden will be president for the next 100 days or so, and has no incentive to incite violence. So I don't think that's going to be the issue this time. History doesn't repeat itself, but I do think it's extremely unlikely Donald Trump would accept the results if Kamala Harris turns out to be the winner tonight or in the next few days. He has on many occasions said this will be rigged, this is an unfair election, and there will be cheating going on. And he's been saying it incessantly, actually, in the last 2 or 3 days. So Trump bowing out and sort of going off into the sunset is not on my bingo card.
Well, he won't likely go into the sunset. He may end up in jail, which also makes it more likely that he'll want to contest the results, no matter, especially if he ends up on the losing side. If men are disproportionately wanting to vote in favor of Trump, according to the polls, and women in favor of Kamala Harris, it comes down to where is their higher propensity to go out and vote, where is the level of interest and enthusiasm higher. On that, Edward Luce, before I let you go, which voting group do you think is more enthusiastic? Are you seeing more enthusiasm amongst men or women?
I'm seeing quite a lot of enthusiasm amongst both, but it's what I would call negative enthusiasm. A real dislike of the other candidate is their chief motivation. So, I mean, historically, women do tend to vote in higher numbers. I think 53% of the electorate last time were female. I'm expecting that to be higher this time, but also that the share of women who vote for Kamala Harris or vote for the Democratic nominee being higher than normal as well because of this whole abortion issue. Women do tend to be a little bit more reliable about voting. So if you were on the Harris campaign and you were clutching at straws right now, I think the gender gap in how reliable you are at turning up to vote would be one of those straws.
I'd leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us, Edward Luce. I want to go across to Danielle Block, Senior Editor at Foreign Affairs. One of the things which tripped pollsters the last time was a lot of people who were voting for Donald Trump were awkward, embarrassed about admitting it, which is why pollsters had to apply for the midterms so many algorithms and ways to try and account for that, which is what ultimately tripped their midterm polls over. So it's really the kind of election where you just sit back, have your coffee, have your popcorn or whatever it is that you will, and allow for the actual votes to be counted. Is this something that you're looking at as well, the fact that voters may not be indicating their actual voting intent when they're being asked about who they intend to vote for, which is why the end result may not be as close as some of these polls are suggesting?
I think that the difficulty pollsters have had when Trump is on the ballot is one of the more interesting storylines that we're going to watch over the course of the night play out. And to your point, in both 2016 and 2020, pollsters had a lot of trouble capturing just how many people would vote for Trump. The exact reasons why that is are disputed. It seems like they had a lot of trouble actually reaching out to Trump's base and simply getting such people on the phone. What's interesting is after 2016, they tried to compensate for that by sampling more white people who didn't go to college. And the idea was that in 2016, they failed to capture enough of those people. Then by sampling more of them, they'd be able to more accurately get the result. And then in 2020, they actually underpredicted Trump's vote share by even more. Biden nonetheless won. So what they've started to do between now and then, they've done a couple of things, but one of the really big things pollsters have started to do is to actually build their models around factors that they don't normally build their models around, like the partisan ID of their sample. And so the question is, will this be enough to accurately capture Trump's vote share? Will it underestimate him again? Have they gotten it wrong again? Or there's some talk that perhaps they're now overestimating Trump's vote share. So polling errors are different from election to election. In the 2022 midterms, they underestimated how Democrats would perform. So really, we just don't know. In part, again, because we don't exactly know what caused the polling errors in the past.
Well, it's, since we deal with a lot of polling and pollsters in India, this is a nightmare situation for anybody to be in. So you've got two kinds of voters. You've got clear Republican voters. You've got clear voters who are very clearly leaning towards the Democrats. Let's look at independent voters who ultimately, which side they swing, will determine where this election goes. And it's also showing the extreme level to which the United States seem polarized. So it's these undecided voters. At the end of the day, nobody will be undecided once polling is over. But it's these undecided voters that both the campaigns have been trying to woo assiduously over the past several weeks. Now, according to the NBC National poll, 51% of the independent voters who identify themselves as independent, not leaning Democrat or Republican, said they'd vote for Kamala Harris. 43% said they'd vote for Donald Trump. If you add to the registered Democrat voters the independent voters as well, it would seem that Kamala Harris is in front. But ordinarily, if you look at the level of anti-incumbency, when Americans were asked, are you satisfied with the way the government has been performing, 70% said they were not happy. Now, that's a very, very big number. Daniel Block, now, usually, if that's the level of anti-incumbency, then it really should be a shoo-in for the non-incumbent for the challenger, which in this case is Donald Trump. But because he's Donald Trump and because of what happened in the past and because of the negativity that he carries to his campaign, it's a much tighter election than it otherwise would have been. Otherwise, this level of dissatisfaction in any country, the incumbent would very clearly be on the way out.
You're right that anti-incumbency bias should be a huge factor here. As you've noted, it's not just the United States. Across the world, incumbents have been tossed out or they've performed more poorly than expected. We saw that in India's recent election where the BJP lost its outright majority. And if Harris loses and Trump wins, expect that to see a reason that's cited. It's very rare. I can't think of the last time, if ever, that an incumbent party that's not running an incumbent presidential candidate for re-election has managed to win when most people think the country is headed in the wrong direction. Having said that, as you noted, there are a few factors that work to Harris's advantage. One is that she's not Biden. She's his vice president, but she's, as a result, able to create some space between him. She's also younger than both Biden and Trump, which allows her to project a more kind of forward-looking energy. The other is, as you said, Trump, and there's two facts about Trump. The first is the fact that he's an incredibly controversial candidate. He is widely disdained by a large portion of the population, also widely beloved by a large portion of the population, so it cuts both ways. The other is he was not president all that long ago, and Americans now have a fonder recollection of his presidency than they did when he was in office. But as a result, Harris has attempted to kind of saddle him with some of the baggage of incumbency. One of the slogans of her campaign is, "We're not going back." So it's unclear to some extent how much anti-incumbency bias is going to work all against Harris, or if some of that will be applied to Trump as well.
Katherine Hader, when you look at the level of people who think the country is going in the wrong direction, if 3/4 of the respondents in any poll say they think the country is going in the wrong direction. It really should be a slam dunk for the challenger, the anti-incumbent, but yet the polls paint a very different picture. So a lot of dissatisfaction coming out in these polling numbers.
Yeah, I think Daniel got it right. I think the Harris campaign is trying to portray Trump as the incumbent, and it hasn't been all that long. I wanted to touch a little bit, though, on the hidden Trump voters, because in the past that was definitely true. And I have always found it true that a lot of times when people lie to polls, which they do, they lie because they're voting in a way that they think will get them condemned in some way. At this point in our political life in the United States, I think those kind of Trump voters are rarer. I think if we're looking for something unexpected, it may be the hidden Harris voter, the woman in Pennsylvania, or even the man in rural Pennsylvania that can vote a lot like Georgia votes. They don't want to admit to their extended family, to their neighbors, to their church, how they're going to vote this time because it's that divisive. So I really think it is anyone's game at this time. And I thought there was a very controversial recent poll from Iowa. Rahul, you seem to follow everything, so you probably saw this. But Iowa, which is a red state, this one pollster, who's a woman, I want to add, found that Harris would win Iowa, which was very controversial. But what she found was the gender gap that you described. And it was particularly striking for women over 65 who in the past had followed Trump, but were now breaking for Harris 2-1.
Sure, and that's an important factor. I want to look at how some of the communities are voting. Let's start with white men and also then non-white men. We'll also talk a bit about people of Indian American origin. The Latinos have been in the news as well. So let's take you through how the community vote is going. Let's start with white voters. 54% saying they're picking Donald Trump. Kamala Harris would be the first woman of color. If she were to get elected, 45% of white voters, so she's weak amongst white voters, 45% of white voters saying they'd vote for Kamala Harris. If we now come to the non-white voters, just taken as a whole, here is where Kamala Harris has a massive advantage. Remember, American demographics have been changing very rapidly. The percentage of whites coming down, non-whites going up. 63% of non-white voters say in this PBS NewsHour Marist poll that they'd vote Kamala Harris versus 34% Donald Trump. This is really Donald Trump's weak link. Let's for a moment take a look at Latino voters. And amongst Latino voters, again, there's been a big blowback against Donald Trump for some of the comments that have been made by him and people associated with his campaign during the campaign trail. 44% saying they'd pick Donald Trump, 53% of Latino voters saying they'd pick Kamala Harris. I want to go across Jant Krishna on the Indian American community. Usually they were seen as being pro-Democrat. Later, Republicans started picking up a lot of vote as well. Is there one candidate who has, in your view, disproportionate advantage amongst Indian Americans? We're seeing Donald Trump oftentimes reach out to Hindus. He spoke about attacks against the Hindu community in Bangladesh and elsewhere. So he's very consciously making an effort to try and attract Hindu voters.
See, Rahul, as far as the Indian diaspora in the US is concerned, my feeling is they will tilt a little more towards Kamala Harris. Because at the end of the day, the choice they have to make is make it, what kind of leadership they want to elect. With Kamala Harris, widely it is expected that she'll be more humanitarian, more principled, more responsible leader. And also there'll be a policy continuity with Kamala Harris. She'll be more predictable. Whereas Trump, a lot of people believe that, he will be divisive. He will even be vindictive. And as the world needs leaders who are more multilateral in their thinking, Trump is clearly more unilateral. He believes in Americanism versus globalism. For him, America comes first, no matter what be the cost, So my worry is, and I'm sure Indian community in the US also thinks the same way. Things like climate change, for example. I mean, we have seen in the last presidency how Trump had walked away from the Paris Accord, and which could have played havoc against the war against climate change. So I think there are lots of issues. UN institutions he doesn't believe in. I mean, not that UN doesn't need to be reformed, but he had reduced the funding to the UN UN bodies. and US is the largest funder. If you look at Europe, Trump could be Europe's nightmare. NATO nations, I mean, he has talked about walking out of NATO. He's forcing NATO countries to spend a certain percentage of their GDP on defense. So there are lots of such things, where the stand on for example, let's talk about the Ukraine and Russia war. One doesn't know which side, how he would resolve those things, because he's known, and several occasions he has said he's expressed his liking for Putin. He says he's a very strong leader.
So let me hold you there and put that question to Michael Kugelman. Michael, step into the minds of world leaders like Vladimir Zelensky, like Vladimir Putin, like Mr. Zelensky, like Xi Jinping, and tell us from their lens and from the lens of their national interest, who would they rather see and why someone like Xi Jinping would really not want to see Donald Trump, because if he raises tariffs in the way that he's saying, what impact could that have on the geopolitical order?
Rapino, this is one of the challenges of trying to make sense of this, and that is that Trump is very unpredictable, right? We could look at his recent views, we could look at how he engaged with the world when he was president, but we really don't know, right? I mean, I don't think that we can rule out, you mentioned President Xi, I don't think we're deciding to try to strike a deal with China. I mean, let's not forget, early in his presidency, Trump had essentially described President Xi as a friend, and he indicated that he wanted the things to work. It wasn't until later in the administration when U.S.-China competition really heated up and things took a different direction. So, yes, I mean, his tariff policies, I think, would be of concern to Beijing, but we don't know what he might try to do in any particular context if he were to return to the presidency. But I think if you want to talk about a President Putin, I think that a leader like that might be inclined to hold off and wait to, if he's considering doing anything drastic as it relates to the war in Ukraine, for example, waiting to see who wins the election on the assumption that if it's Trump, there might be more receptivity to what Putin is doing or might want to do in Ukraine. So it's just very difficult to predict.
Well, let's just hold off for a few hours and then we will have a better sense of who wins. Also, don't just go by the early exit polls. Allow for votes actually to be counted, because the exit polls can throw up confusing results as well. I'll thank all our guests for joining us. This is indeed a very exciting election. I think that it's much easier to comment when you don't have any skin in the game. If it's an Indian poll and if it's an Indian election and you put out your own poll, then it's far more nerve-wracking than it is right now. But I wish you all the best. Thank you so much for joining us on this show.